What did Richard Feynman realize after observing von Neumann's mind about genius? There is a particular kind of moment that almost never gets discussed in the history of science. It is not the moment of discovery or the moment of publication, or even the moment when an idea changes everything. It is a quieter and more personal moment, the moment when one extraordinary mind watches another and walks away slightly unsettled, not because what it witnessed was wrong, but because it was so radically different. That moment carries a question inside it that doesn't resolve quickly. It lingers. It asks, what is intelligence really? What does it mean to think well? And why do we so often assume there is only one answer? We live in a world that tends to flatten genius into a single image. We imagine it as speed, as memory, as the ability to hold enormous amounts of information in the mind at once and move through it without friction. We picture the gifted person as someone who never hesitates, never second guesses, never stares at a blank page, wondering where to begin. And because this image is so pervasive, we sometimes fail to notice that the people who actually shaped our understanding of the universe, the people who contributed most deeply to mathematics, physics, and the architecture of modern thought, did not all look like that image. Some of them were methodical, some were visual, some were slow by conventional standards, but arrived at places no one else had thought to look. And some of them were genuinely bewildered by the presence of minds unlike their own. The 20th century produced a remarkable concentration of intellectual talent. The mid-century decades were unusually fertile ground, partly because of historical pressure, and partly because institutions were forming that gathered people of exceptional ability into shared spaces. These environments produced extraordinary work, but they also produced something that is less often discussed: profound encounters between different kinds of minds. People who had spent their lives being the most capable thinker in any room suddenly found themselves in rooms where that was no longer true, or where the nature of capability itself seemed to shift depending on who was standing next to them. These encounters were sometimes exhilarating, sometimes they were quietly unsettling, and occasionally they were the kind of experience that causes a person to revise their entire understanding of what thinking is. Richard Feynman was one of the most original scientific minds of the 20th century. This is not a controversial claim, and it requires no elaboration by appeal to prizes or positions. What made him unusual was not primarily his technical capability, though that was formidable. It was the way he engaged with problems, visually, intuitively, through a kind of physical imagination that allowed him to inhabit the systems he was studying rather than merely describing them from the outside. He thought in images and processes before he thought in symbols. He would often arrive at a result through routes that his colleagues found difficult to follow, not because the routes were wrong, but because they were genuinely foreign, built from a different internal architecture of reasoning. And this made him confident in some respects and quietly vulnerable in others. He knew he could see things others missed. He also knew that certain modes of operation, certain ways of being brilliant, were largely unavailable to him. John von Neumann occupied a different register of mind entirely. To encounter his thinking was not simply to meet someone who was faster or more knowledgeable, though both of those things were part of the experience. It was to meet someone whose cognitive processes seemed to operate at a different level of abstraction simultaneously. He could engage with a problem at multiple layers at once: formal, structural, applied, generalized, without apparent effort to shift between them. Where many thinkers move through intellectual terrain in a linear way, building from one point to the next, von Neumann seemed to survey a much wider field from a much greater height, identifying connections that others would only see after lengthy work. His mind did not seem to tire of abstraction. It seemed, in fact, to find abstraction its most natural habitat. This is important to understand because it shapes what the encounter between these two kinds of intelligence actually meant. It was not a competition. It was not even, in the conventional sense, a comparison. It was more like the experience of discovering that a concept you thought was simple and singular, the concept of thinking well, is in fact plural, and that different versions of it are not reducible to one another. Feynman was not a lesser von Neumann, and von Neumann was not a better Feynman. They were, in a deep sense, operating in different cognitive languages. And the recognition of that difference is where the most interesting insight begins. When people who worked alongside both men in those decades describe the experience, a common thread emerges in the texture of their accounts, even when the specific details differ. There was something almost disorienting about watching von Neumann process a new problem. The speed was obvious and is the thing most often commented upon, but speed alone is not what made it strange. What was stranger was the apparent absence of groping. Most people, even very capable people, work through intellectual difficulty with visible effort. There are false starts, corrections, moments of uncertainty that show on the surface of the work. With von Neumann, the visible uncertainty was often absent, or so compressed into an interval too brief to observe that it seemed not to exist. He would engage with a new problem and very quickly begin to speak about it in a way that suggested he had already mapped much of its internal structure. Not every aspect of it. He was not infallible, and those who knew him well were clear about that, but more of it, and more rapidly, than seemed natural. For someone like Feynman, whose own thinking involved a great deal of internal wrestling, not because he lacked ability, but because his mode of reasoning required genuine construction, required building the intuitive picture before the formal one. This was a genuinely foreign experience to witness, and it raised a question that could not be dismissed. If a mind could operate like that, what did it mean for the way Feynman himself operated? Was his method a limitation dressed up as a style? Or was it something else, a different instrument suited to different work? The answer, which emerges slowly from understanding both men's actual contributions, is that it was something else. It was a different instrument, and crucially, it was an instrument capable of doing certain things that von Neumann's mode of cognition was not naturally positioned to do. Feynman's physics was marked by a willingness to think about what was physically happening, not just formally, but concretely. He wanted to know what an electron was doing, not just what the equations governing it looked like. This sounds like a small preference, but it is actually a profound methodological difference. It meant that his intuitions were grounded in something physical, in a modeled reality, and that when the formal machinery of a theory led somewhere that felt physically wrong to him, he trusted that feeling enough to investigate it rather than simply accepting the mathematical result. This led him to contributions that were not just technically correct, but genuinely illuminating. Contributions that reshaped how physicists thought about the underlying machinery of the universe. Von Neumann's contributions were of a different kind, but no less fundamental. His work in mathematics, in the foundations of quantum mechanics, in game theory, in the architecture of computing, and in numerous other domains, was characterized by a kind of structural clarity that revealed deep order beneath apparent complexity. He built frameworks. He laid foundations. He identified the abstract skeleton of a problem and showed how, once you could see that skeleton, large territories of apparently different problems turned out to be variations on the same underlying form. This is a different kind of insight from Feynman's. It is less about inhabiting a problem and more about elevating above it, seeing its shape from a distance that makes the shape legible. And it produced results that were not just solutions, but entire new languages for thinking. What is worth sitting with is the fact that each of these modes had genuine limits. Feynman's visual and physical intuition was a remarkable tool for generating insight, but it was not always easily communicated to others, and it did not always translate naturally into the kind of formal generality that allows a result to be used in entirely different domains. He sometimes found formal abstraction less interesting than the physical reality it was meant to describe, and this occasionally placed limits on the range of problems he naturally engaged with. Von Neumann's structural brilliance, on the other hand, was almost universal in its range. There was no domain of human knowledge he seemed incapable of entering and organizing. But the very height of the abstraction could sometimes work against the kind of deeply embodied physical insight that reshaped fundamental theory. Speed and range do not guarantee the particular kind of depth that comes from spending a long time inside a single problem, turning it over slowly, feeling its resistance. This is where the emotional dimension of extreme intelligence becomes relevant, and it is a dimension that is rarely given the weight it deserves. People who think at the level these men did are not immune to doubt. In some ways, they are more acutely susceptible to a particular form of it, the form that comes from being able to see, with unusual clarity, the distance between what you have achieved and what you have not yet understood. Ordinary people are protected from a certain kind of intellectual suffering by the limits of their own perception. They cannot fully see what they are missing. Those with unusual cognitive ability can sometimes see it quite clearly, and the experience of that gap is not necessarily pleasant. Feynman was known, among those who observed him over long periods, for a certain restlessness that was not merely energetic, but also evaluative. He was always measuring his work against a standard that seemed to shift upward as he approached it. There was something in him that was never fully satisfied, not because he was neurotic or self-destructive, but because his sensitivity to the quality of understanding was calibrated at a level where genuine insight was always distinguishable from mere competence, and genuine insight was never quite complete enough. Von Neumann, for his part, operated under pressures of a different kind, the pressure of a mind that could engage with almost anything and therefore felt drawn in many directions simultaneously, and the particular difficulty of sustaining the kind of deep focus required for the most fundamental problems when your range of capability makes every passing intellectual territory interesting. Neither of these is a comfortable way to exist, and recognizing this is important because it corrects a romantic misunderstanding about what genius feels like from the inside. The popular image of the brilliant person is one of ease, of thinking that flows without friction, of a relationship with difficulty that turns all resistance into pleasure. The reality is more complicated. Extraordinary capability does not eliminate the experience of limitation. It often intensifies it, because the person capable of it can perceive the limitation with greater precision. And the company of other extraordinary minds does not dissolve this experience. It sometimes deepens it, because it makes visible the fact that there are multiple forms of capability, and that possessing one in abundance does not guarantee possession of the others. There is something important in this for how we think about intelligence in general, not just at the level of these particular figures, but at every level. We are accustomed to treating intelligence as a single dimension along which people can be ranked. This is a convenient simplification, and it is not entirely without empirical basis. Certain cognitive abilities do correlate with one another, and general measures of intellectual performance do predict performance across a reasonably wide range of tasks. But the simplification obscures something real and important. The actual work of understanding, of making genuine progress in knowledge, whether in science, mathematics, art, or any other domain, draws on cognitive resources that are genuinely plural. The ability to hold formal structures in mind and manipulate them is one such resource. The ability to generate strong intuitions about the behavior of complex systems is another. The ability to communicate ideas in ways that make them accessible and generative is another still. The ability to sustain uncertainty without resolving it prematurely is yet another. None of these is simply a form of the others. And the history of intellectual achievement includes people who were strong in very different combinations of these capacities. This means that the comparison between Feynman and von Neumann, or between any two people of unusual ability, is not a question with a clean answer. It is not a question of who was better, or who was more intelligent, or whose contributions were more important? These questions cannot be answered honestly because they rest on an assumption that there is a single currency of intellectual value in which all contributions can be denominated. That does not correspond to reality. What we can say is that both men contributed profoundly to human knowledge, that they did so by different means, that each could see things the other was less well positioned to see, and that the world benefited from having both of them operating in it simultaneously. And there is a further step, which is perhaps the most important one. If this is true of minds at the very extreme of human capability, if even at that altitude, intelligence is plural rather than singular, and different cognitive styles reveal different aspects of truth, then it is almost certainly true throughout the full range of human cognition. The student who learns slowly but retains everything they absorb, the person who cannot follow an abstract argument easily, but who grasps immediately what something means for the real world, the thinker who cannot articulate a process but produces solutions that others spend months trying to reverse engineer. These are not failed versions of some ideal cognitive type. They are instantiations of the genuine plurality of thinking, operating at different scales. The error that comparison produces is not just a social one, not just a matter of being unfair to people whose abilities are different from the dominant norm. It is an epistemic error. When we collapse intelligence into a single dimension and rank people along it, we lose sight of the ways in which different cognitive profiles contribute to collective understanding. We may systematically undervalue the contributions of people whose mode of thinking is less visible, less easily quantified, or less well matched to formal institutional environments. And we may fail to notice that the problems most worth solving often require precisely the combination of cognitive styles that no single person, however exceptional, can embody alone. Feynman and von Neumann, in the years when their careers overlapped and their minds occasionally engaged with overlapping problems, were not simply two very smart people working in the same field. They were, in a sense, a demonstration of something that the field itself required: the coexistence of radically different ways of seeing. And whatever discomfort or unsettlement their encounters may have produced in either of them, whatever quiet moments of self-assessment or recalibration those encounters may have occasioned, the knowledge they both produced is richer for the fact that neither one won a competition that was never really taking place. What a mind like Feynman's could do, in the end, was not simply produce physics. It could model something about how intelligence actually works, how it is embedded in personality, in sensory imagination, in a relationship to physical reality that is particular and not universal. And what the observation of a mind like von Neumann's added to that model was not a correction, but a dimension, a demonstration that abstraction, taken to its furthest point, is itself a form of insight, a way of touching truth that feels entirely different from the inside, but that lands ultimately in the same place of genuine understanding. We are all, in some sense, working with cognitive equipment that is shaped by factors we did not choose and cannot fully map. We have the tools we have. The question is not whether they are the best tools in absolute terms, a question that has no stable answer, but whether we use them with the full attention and honesty they deserve. The greatest minds of the 20th century did not understand everything. They carried uncertainty with them into the most fundamental questions, and they carried self-doubt into rooms where they were, by any ordinary measure, the most capable people present. This is not a diminishment of what they achieved. It is, if anything, the most humanizing, and therefore the most useful thing we can learn from their example. Understanding is not a destination any mind fully reaches. It is a direction in which different kinds of thinking move, each by its own path, each illuminating terrain that the others might not have found. The value of an unusual mind is not that it transcends this condition. It is that it moves further into it, and in doing so, shows the rest of us that the territory is larger than we thought, and more varied, and more worth exploring than any single cognitive style could ever fully reveal.